Hello, beautiful people. I'm going to be reading Pride and Prejudice, Volume 3, Chapter 2. Let's start now. Elizabeth had settled it that Mr. Darcy would bring his sister to visit her. The very day after her reaching Pemberley, and was constantly resolved not to be out of sight of the inn the whole of that morning, but her conclusion was forced, for on the very morning after their own arrival at Lambton, these visitors came. They had been walking about the place with some of their new friends, and were just returned to the inn to dress themselves for the dining with the same family when the sound of a carriage drew them to a window, and they saw a gentleman and a lady in the car- carriage. Let me look this up. Curricle. Driving up the street, Elizabeth, immediately recognizing the livery, guessed what it meant, and imparted no small degree of surprise to her relations by acquitting them with the honour which she expected. Her uncle and aunt were all amazement, and the embarrassment of her manner as she spoke, joined to the circumstance itself, and many of the circumstances of the preceding day, opened to them a new idea on the business. Nothing had ever suggested it before, but they now felt that there was no other way of accounting for such attention from such a quarter than by supposing a partiality for their niece. While these newly born notions were passing in their heads, the preditation, let me look it up. Perturbation. Perturbation. Perturbation of Elizabeth's feelings was every moment increasing. She was quite amazed at her own discomposure, but among other causes of disquiet, she dreaded lest the partiality of the brother should have said too much in her favour, and more than commonly anxious to please. She naturally suspected that every power of pleasing would fail her. She retreated from the window, fearful of being seen, and as she walked up and down the room, endeavouring to compose herself, saw such books of enquiring surprise in her uncle and aunt as they made everything worse. Miss Darcy and her brother appeared, and this formidable introduction took place. With astonishment did Elizabeth see that her new acquaintance was at least as much as embarrassed as herself. Since her being at Lambton, she had heard that Miss Darcy was exceedingly proud, but the observation of a very few minutes convinced her that she was only exceedingly shy. She found it difficult to obtain even a word from her beyond a monosyllable. Miss Darcy was tall on a large scale from Elizabeth, and thought little more than 16. Her figure was formed, and her appearance womanly and graceful. She was less handsome than her brother, but there was sense and good humor in her face, and her manners were perfectly unassuming and gentle. Elizabeth, who had expected to find in her as acute and unembarrassed an observer as ever Mr. Darcy has been, was much relieved by discerning such different feelings. They had not been long together before Darcy told her that Bentley was also coming to wait on her, and she had barely time to express her satisfaction and prepare for such a visit when Bentley's quick step was heard on the steps, and in a moment he entered the room. All Elizabeth's anger against him had been long done away, but had she still felt any, she could hardly have stood its ground against the unaffected cordiality which with which he expressed himself on seeing her again. He required in a friendly though general way after her family looked and spoke with the same good humoured ease that he had ever done. To Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner he was scarcely a less interesting personage than to herself. They had long wished to see him. The whole party was before them indeed excited a lively attention. The suspicions which had just arisen of Mr. Darcy and their niece directed their observation towards each with an earnest though guarded inquiries, and they soon drew from these inquiries and the full conviction that one of them at least knew what it was to love. Of the lady's sensation they remained a little in doubt, but that the gentleman was overflowing with admiration was evident enough. Oh my god. Prejudice. Okay, let's continue. Elizabeth on her side had much to do. She wanted to ascertain ascer, as, ascertain ascertain the feelings of each of her visitors. She wanted to compose her own and to make herself agreeable to all. And in the latter object where she feared most to fail, she was the most sure of success. For those to whom she endeavored to give pleasure were pre prepossessed in her favor. Bentley was ready, Georgina was eager, Darcy determined to be pleased in seeing Bentley. Her thoughts naturally flew to her sister, and oh, how ad- ardently did she long to know whether any of his were directed like manner. Sometimes she could fancy that he talked less than on formal occasion, and once or twice pleased herself with the notion that as he looked at her he was trying to trace a resemblance. But though this might be imaginary, she could not be deceived as to his behaviour to Miss Darcy, who had being set up as a revival of Jane. No look appeared on the other side that spoke particular regard. Nothing occurred between them that could justify the hopes of his sister. On this point she was soon satisfied, and two or three little circumstances occurred, and they parted, which in her anxious interpretation denoted a collection of Jane not untainted by tenderness, and a wish of saying more that might lead to the mention of her had he dared. He observed her at a moment when the others were talking, and in a tone which had something of real, and that it was a very long time since he had had the pleasure of seeing her. And before she could reply, he added, "It is about 6 months. We have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield." Elizabeth was pleased to find his memory so exact, and he afterward took occasion to ask her, when unattended to by any of the rest, whether all her sisters were at Longbourn. There was not much in question, none in preceding remarks, but there was a look and a manner which gave them meaning. It was not often that she could return her eyes on Mr. Darcy himself, but whenever she did catch a glimpse, she saw on an expression of general compliance, complacence, but in all that he said, she heard an accent so far removed from the hauteur of all this disdain of his companions as convinced her the improvement of manner which she had yesterday witnessed, however temporary in existence, might prove had at least outlived one day. And when she saw him thus seeking the acquaintance and courting the good opinion of people with whom any intercourse a few months ago would have been a disgrace, when she saw him thus civil not only to herself but to the very relation whom he had openly disda- disdained. Is this disdained? Disdained, and recollected the last lively scene in Hansford personage. The change was so great and struck so forcibly on her mind, and she could hardly restrain her astonishment from being visible, never in the company of his dear friends at Netherfield, or his dignified relation at Rosen, had she seen him so desirous to please, so free from self-conscience or unbounded reserve as now, whom as the when no importance could result from the success of his endeavour, and when even the coincidence of those to whom his attention were addressed would draw down the ridiculous and conscience of the ladies both of Netherfield and Rosings. Their visitors stayed with them above half an hour, and they rose to depart. Mr. Darcy called on his sister to join him, expressing their wish of seeing Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and Mrs. Bennet to dinner at Pemberley before they left the country. Miss Darcy, though with a defi- def- diffidence, which marked her little in the habit of giving invitations, readily obeyed. Mrs. Gardner looked at her niece, desirous of knowing how she, whom the invitation most concerned, felt disposed as to its acceptance, but Elizabeth had turned away her head, pre- presuming, however, steady that this steady avoidance spoke rather a momentary embarrassment than any dislike of the proposal, and seeing in her husband, who was fond of society, a perfect willingness to accept it, she ventured to engage for her attendance, and the day after the next was fixed on. Bentley expressed great content in the certainty of seeing Elizabeth again, having still a great friend to say to her and many inquiries to make after all their Hertfordshire friends. Elizabeth, construing all this into a wish of hearing her speak of her sister, was pleased, and on this account, as well as some others, found herself, when their visitors left them, capable of considering the last half hour with some satisfaction, though while it was passing, the enjoyment of it had been little. Eager to be alone, and fright and fate and fearful of inquiries or hints from her husband or aunt, she stayed with them only long enough to hear their favorable opinions of Bentley and then hurried away to dress. And she had no reason to fear Mr. and Mrs. Gardner's curiosity. It was not their wish to force her communication. It was evident that she was much better acquainted with Mr. Darcy than any had before any had had before had before any idea of. It was evident that he was very much in love with her. They saw much to interest, but nothing to justify enquiry of Mr. Darcy was now a matter of anxiety and think well, and as far as their acquaintance reached, there was no fault to find. They could not be untouched by his politeness, and had they drawn his character from their own feelings, his servant reports, without any reference to any other account, the circle in Hertfordshire to which he was known, which would not have recognized it for Mr. Darcy. There was now an interest, however, in believing the housekeeper, and they soon became sensible that the authority of a servant had known him since he was 4 years old. 4 years old, and whose own manners indicated respectability, was not to be hastily rejected. Neither has anything occurred in the intelligence of their Lambton friends, and that could material lessen it. Wait, they had nothing to accuse him of but pride. Pride he probably had, and if not, it not certainly be imputed by the inhabitants of a small market town where the family did not visit. It was acknowledged, however, that he was a liberal man and did much good among the poor. With respect to Wickham, and the travellers soon found that he was not held there in much estimation, for though the chief of his commands concerned with the son of his patron and were perfectly understood, it was yet a well-known fact that on his quitting Derbyshire he had left many debts behind him, which Mr. Darcy afterward discharged. As for Elizabeth, her thoughts were at Pemberley this evening more than the last, and the evening Though it is past, it seemed long was not long enough to determine her feeling towards one in that mansion. She lay awake for 2 whole hours, endeavoring to make them out. She certainly did not hate him. No, hatred had vanished long ago, and she had almost long have been has she had almost as long been ashamed ever feeling a dislike against him that could be so called. The respect created by the conviction of his valuable qualities, though at first unwillingly admitted, had for some time ceased to be re, repu, repugnant, repugnant to her feelings, and it was now heightened into somewhat of a friendlier nature by the testimony so highly in his favour, and bringing forward his deposition in so amiable a light, which yesterday had produced. But above all, above respect and esteem, there was a motive which her of good will which could not be overlooked. It was gratitude. Gratitude not merely for having one's lover, but for loving her till well enough to forgive all the pet petulance and acrimony of her manner in rejecting sorry, I just laughed. In rejecting him and all the unjust accusation accompanying accompanying her rejection. He who she had been persuaded would avoid her as his greatest enemy, and seemed on this accidental meeting most eager to preserve the acquaintance, and without any indelicate display of regard or any preliminaries of manner where her true self only were concerned was soliciting the good opinions of her friends, and bent on making her known to her sister. Such a change in man of so much pride excited not only astonishment but grave gratitude for to love, ardent love. It must be attributed, and and as such, its impression of her was of a sort to be encouraged, as by no means unpleasing. Though it could not be exactly defined, she respected, she esteemed, she was grateful to him, she felt a real interest in his welfare, and she only wanted to know how far she wished that welfare to depend upon herself, and how far it would be for the happiness of both that she should employ the power which her fancy told her she still possessed of bringing on the renewal of his address. It has been settled in the evening between the aunt and aunt that such a striking civility as Miss Darcy in coming to him on the very day of her arrival at Pemberley, and for she had reached it only to a late breakfast, ought to be imitated, though it could not be equalled by some exertion of politeness on their side, and coincidentally that it would be highly expedient to wait on her at Pemberley the following morning. They were therefore to go. Elizabeth was pleased, though when she asked herself the reason, she had very little to say in reply. Mr. Gardiner left them soon after breakfast, and the fishing scheme had been renewed the day before, and a positive engagement made of his meeting some of the gentlemen at Pemberley by noon. Okay, I'm done, guys. I'm so proud of myself. And I'm realizing something, right? Instead of like reading aloud, I've changed my mind. I'll set a timer every day, and now that I've practiced and I know that I can read classic, when I'm done reading it, but I'm gonna finish this book reading aloud, and then for the next book, I'll read and I'll read and I'll use that like to do like a challenge. How many like I don't know how many pages to read. Like I'll do a pages or I'll still do it the same way, but I'll do maybe 2 pages. I'll read 2 pages a day, right, or 3 pages so that I can finish it quicker when I'm reading. But I'm not gonna do the read aloud anymore. But I'm gonna try to read quicker than I usually did. Right now, I've been reading one chapter, so for the next book, my challenge is gonna be like more than one chapter. It's gonna be like 2 or 3 a day, right? But I'm gonna set a timer and read. I'm gonna do that, and I think this has been a great thing for me, and I'm realizing like I can actually read classic book, and I'm gonna pick another classic book to read. Yeah, I'm gonna do it like the next book. I'm probably gonna do it alone so that I can spend time with my alone quietly, so that I can that too. I can use reading to help me with boardroom, sit in boardroom. Yeah, I can use it to do sit in boardroom. And when I'm done reading the book, I'm gonna watch the movie. Yeah, I'm gonna finish the book very soon. See? Yeah, when I'm done reading the book, I'm gonna watch the movie too. Yeah. Thank you. I'm done. I hope you guys have a nice day. And I'm gonna read the next chapter tomorrow. I'm gonna read the next chapter tomorrow. Bye bye.